Ladies and gentlemen, before Jack starts the proceedings, I would like to say just one thing. Myself and Roger Freeman will be leading in today with the speakers. As you know, we're both from England. The question is now, do you need an interpreter, or do you think you'll be able to understand?
I think if you need one, you're out of luck. Welcome to the Marauder story. We had hoped to make this a 100% live presentation, but old Father Time has ravaged our ranks. Some of those Marauder men we were counting on to tell their stories have taken their last flight, while others will be on TDY outside the zone of the interior, and too many have been taken off flying status due to the inevitable redlining on their Form 1s for the flying physical disabilities that plague our age group. We just recently had 2 cancellations, so on your program, Robert Isle, due to a family emergency, and Pren Moore, due to serious sickness, couldn't be here. However, consequently, some of the Marauder story segments today will be in the form of video interviews. This isn't all bad, since it qualifies us as this is a multimedia presentation and puts us in the running for all sorts of awards. So, adjust the tuning and volume knobs on your command sets and listen to the saga of the finest medium bomber in World War II. We are honored to have with us today 2 distinguished English gentlemen who, as young boys during World War II, were enthralled with Marauders taking off and landing, joining up for missions from bases near their homes. And they will ensure that all checkpoints, the Marauder story, flight plan, hit dead center. Roger Freeman is the leading World War II aircraft author in the United Kingdom and is specialized with world-class books about the United States 8th and 9th Air Forces. His latest world-class book will be the 9th Air Force in color, and it's due out yet this summer and will contain some 280 rare color shots of the 9th bases, aircraft, and personnel. Trevor Allen is the leading B-26 historian, the one with the English accent, in the world, and has assembled a data library of the life of every combat B-26. Gentlemen, we're indeed proud to have you on board as crew members. And now that we're lined up for takeoff, Roger, bend those throttles to the firewall and get this Marauder story airborne.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, wrong accent, sorry. All of the performers that you will hear today consider that their participation is an honor and a privilege. And let me express for them all this pleasure. The men participating here today were actors in a great story. They would each individually like to express their own personal delight in participating, but in the interest of time, allow me to do it here and now for all of them. The Marauder story will be told in 3 segments, and let me suggest that we confine our applause to the end of each segment. So here we go. Now, 20 years ago, when I was researching for a book on the most maligned of all Second World War aircraft called the Marauder, I discovered that there were 2 gentlemen who had made a great study of this fine aircraft. And one was a fellow called Bernie Mallon in New York, who'd studied the nuts and bolts side, and the other was a fellow called Trevor Allen, one of my own countrymen, this fellow that you see here today, and he had really concentrated on individual Marauders at that time, but he has come, in my opinion, to know more about the B-26 Marauder than anyone else on this earth. So to start today's presentation, I ask him to provide us with a brief chronology of B-26 highlights. Trevor.
Ladies and gentlemen, in the beginning, there was Peyton Magruder and a design team that put together an aeroplane that you knew as the B-26, that we in the UK came to know as the Marauder. The story that we shall unfold today is not only of the use of that aeroplane in combat, but more importantly, of the men who took it as an untried weapon of war and turned it into a superb combat aircraft through their own individual efforts. This is the tribute that we pay to you. Quickly through the chronology, after Peyton Magruder and his team turned out this airplane, they turned it over to the Air Corps. The first unit was the 22nd Bomb Group. They did most of the trials and testing of this airplane, and eventually were the first ones to take it into combat. On the 5th of April 1942, the Martin B-26 Marauder and the 22nd Bomb Group proved that they could fight the enemy. On that day, a flight of the 22nd Bomb Group Marauders bombed Rabaul in New Guinea. That was the start for a great many other units to take this airplane into battle. And quickly running through that list, the next unit was the 28th Bomb Group, when two of the squadrons in the Aleutians chain ran a mission against Japanese shipping on the 4th of June 1942. This was coincidental with an attack on the Japanese fleet at Midway, when two airplanes of the 69th Bomb Squadron and two airplanes of the 22nd Bomb Group flew against the Japanese fleet. Shortly afterwards, it was the privilege of 14th Squadron, Royal Air Force, to take their Marauders into action on the 22nd of October 1942, only shortly beating the 17th Bomb Squadron, who attacked shipping on the 15th of November 1942 off Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands chain. The theatre of war then moved to the Middle East, into North Africa, when the 319th Bomb Group attacked German airfield at Kairouan on the 28th of November 1942. Thereafter being followed by the 17th Bomb Group, which attacked Gabies airfield on the 30th of December 1942. The next unit was the 320th, who attacked Carlo Forti Harbour in Sardinia on the 22nd of April 1943. Again, there was a shift of theatre. The next unit to go into action was the 322nd Bomb Group, operating from England, and on the 14th of May, they flew the first low-level mission to Amouden power station in Holland. There was a lull in operations in the UK until 16th of July 1943, when the 323rd Bomb Group ran the first medium-altitude mission to Abbeville marshalling yards in France. This was to be the precursor of all future B-26 operations in Europe from medium altitude. The 323rd were quickly followed by the 386, who on the 30th of July attacked Woensdrecht airfield. On the 15th of August, the 387th Bomb Group attacked St. Omer Fort Rouge. And then it was again a change of theatre when the 24th Squadron, South African Air Force, bombed Ponte Multazana in the Aegean on the 31st of January 1944. Again, back to the UK, the 391st Bomb Group ran an attack against Beaumont-le-Roger airfield in France on the 16th of February 1944. The next unit was a very special unit. Very special in the fact that the first Pathfinder Squadron bombed by radar and led many subsequent missions in very poor weather conditions in the European theatre of operations. Again, back to the Middle East and the Aegean, and 12th Squadron, South African Air Force, took the B-26 into operation on the 2nd of March to Knin marshalling yards in Yugoslavia. That has rumblings back again today, unfortunately. The 344th Bomb Group, on the 6th of March, attacked Conches airfield in France. Shortly followed thereafter by the 394th Bomb Group, on the 23rd of March, to Beaumont-le-Roger again. Airfields seemed to be very popular. Then came a change. The next unit to go into action was a French unit, Groupe de Bombardement 122, which on the 29th of March bombed Porto Ferraggi at Elba. The 397th Bomb Group was next to follow. On the 20th April 1944, they bombed a no-ball target at Le Pluie in France. And if you don't know what a no-ball was, it was a pilotless secret weapon. Again, the French went into action with GB 220 on the 24th of May, bombing Liri Valley Road targets in Italy. Another French unit, 119, on the 15th of June, bombed Dorna Railroad Bridge near Spezia. On the 20th of July, another French unit, 252, bombed Borgo 40 Railroad Bridge. And on the 10th of August, back in the UK, the 25th Bomb Group operated the first night photographic reconnaissance mission using B-26s to the no-ball sites in France. 21 Squadron South African Air Force were to follow on the 15th of August, bombing Porto Maggiore Railroad sidings. On the 25th of August, 30 Squadron South African Air Force bombed Forlì marshalling yards in Italy, followed by 2 French units, 132 and 263 on the 12th and 19th of September, bombing Firenzuola defense positions in Italy. On the 20th of November, 25 Squadron South African Air Force bombed Konjic marshalling yards in Yugoslavia. And then another special unit, the 410th Bomb Group, in reality an A-20 unit, equipped with several B-26s for special nighttime marking missions, began operation on the 1st of February 1945 when they bombed Ilocos Communication Center. The last, but certainly not the least squadron to operate the B-26, and I have to be very careful here, was 39 Squadron Royal Air Force, who on the 7th of February 1945 bombed Senje Arbor installations in Yugoslavia. All those units across the world, operated by men of very many different nationalities, were to prove in the end the effectiveness of the Martin B-26 Marauder and the trueness of the design. Gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that I ask Roger Freeman to step up to the podium to carry on. Thank you.
I know he deserves it, ladies and gentlemen, but as we said earlier on, can you sort of leave your applause to the end of each session, because we have a lot to get through in 5 hours, and the time is flying. So I mustn't cackle on, but start to tell you that on March the 11th, 1939, the Material Division at Wright Field issued Circular Proposal 39640, which called not only for a new twin-engine bomber, but also for a new and potentially hazardous procurement procedure. The airplane winning the contest was to be ordered into quantity production directly from the drawing board, thus abandoning for the first time the traditional fly-before-you-buy prototype service test policy. Patent Magruder designed the Glenn L. Martin entry. To tell us about that man is his son, Bob Magruder. Bob.
Peyton Magruder was born October 19, 1911, at Fort Riley, Kansas, and he was raised as an Army brat. His father was promoted to Brigadier General about the time the B-26s started rolling off the assembly lines at the Martin Company. He attended the Naval Academy in 1930, studying engineering science, and then the University of Alabama, where he studied aeronautical engineering. It was there that he met his future wife, Julia Modley, and they married in 1935. I'd like to introduce Julia Magruder to you now. Mom, would you please stand? That's my wife sitting next to her. That's Angie. His first job was at the Naval Aircraft Factory, where he met and worked with the Dean of American Aircraft Designers, Bill Miller. He gave my dad a thorough grounding in the details of aircraft design. They co-authored 8 technical journals that appeared in Aero Digest and other technical journals of the day. And that brought him an offer from the Martin Company, where he started to work in 1937 at the age of 26. At the Martin Company, he quickly progressed to increasing levels of responsibility, far faster than I can comprehend, and many of you probably the same way. He started as a group leader, working on a piece of the airplane, a tail or fuselage or a wing, and then he also worked as a senior aerodynamist. His first promotion was to the development department, where he assisted in the design of many of the Martin planes that were under design at the time. Next, he was promoted to be the assistant project manager for Mr. James S. McDonnell, who was the project manager for the Maryland. This was an instrumental period of development as a project manager, I would assume. Not being there, not being born, I couldn't tell you, but Mr. McDonnell left shortly after this period, about a year later, and formed his own company. If some of you probably have heard of the McDonnell Douglas Aircraft Company. He went to St. Louis, and on the way out, he asked my dad if he'd like to be his executive vice president. In June of 1939, Martin was in the throes of preparing a proposal, as was discussed, that was announced in March. And I can see from my dad's time card at Martin Company, his life changed in June. If you're following me so far, he's 27 now. After the first week of June, his life went into hell, and he didn't come out for 4 weeks. He worked 184 hours and 4 weeks of overtime. And during that 4-week period, he designed what the B-26 should be. It was one of 15 designs that were competing at the Martin Company, and Glenn L. Martin selected my dad's proposal to be the proposal that Glenn L. Martin would fight to win this contract. And it did. And as a result of that winning, my dad was promoted to be the project engineer. It's hard watching my mother get emotional. She told me before I started that my dad used to say, just think of everybody in the audience as being naked. And that'll make you feel a little better. I'm just ashamed at the way you all look right now. Well, this is the reason he didn't leave to go with Mr. McDonnell. This is an opportunity for a designer that was unparalleled, probably, in that company's history. I asked my mother last week, what's the origin of the word Marauder? Now, we've got a lot of historians in here, and these two behind me and a couple in front, I had dinner with some Martin retirees. This is apparently a historical problem. My mother didn't have any problem with the answer. The word Martin and the word Magruder equals Marauder, period. Now, there are historians in here that think that came from England, and I don't want to disagree with anybody because I don't know for certain, but I accept my mother's judgment on that one. Mr. Walter Bones did some interviews with my dad, and it's really called, it gave me an insight of some of the trials and tribulations of producing a bomber, the magnitude of the B-26 with the amount of innovative changes that this design had in it. And in the wings and in air power, 1973, are a lot of conversational, it's a conversational interview with my dad. And it has some unique stories, and if you're really interested in this period, I'd call your attention to those documents to read. One thing I did pick up gleaming from that was my dad always, in my mind, was a super salesman. If anybody ever said anything complimentary about my dad, it was he could sell Eskimos, refrigerators, and freezers. And apparently, project managing a plane like this is a sales job. Selling the General Electrics, the Alcoas, the Otis elevators, the Roman Hosses, to get off their behindies and do something they haven't done before, be innovative, build something that has never existed before, that's beyond the box of reality in their minds. And he did that. And he was able to convince the American industry mites to do that with his team at Martin. And I think that it's a real tribute to the Glenn L. Martin Company and to the industry of America that we had this plane, the B-26, produced. My dad's favorite invention, and I'll just cover one, was the electric turret. That didn't exist. A wire came from right field, and I'm getting away from what I'm supposed to be talking about. A wire came to Martin Company. It landed on my dad's desk, and he answered the wire directly to right field and said, "Yes, it's possible to have electric turret, and we will demonstrate it in 3 weeks. Meet you at Aberdeen Proving Grounds." Mr. Martin and the company executive board were furious with my dad because it didn't exist. No one knew what it was and knew how to make it happen. He took some experimental motors that were around the warehouse, put some potentiometers on it, got together with a man named Mr. Huey, Homer Huey, a Martin employee, and they built this thing and demonstrated it. First time it fired effectively. And over 50,000 models of this were built for 20 different combat aircraft during World War II. On November 29th, and again I find this is another historical discussion point, the official first flight of the bomber took place 1940, November 29th. There apparently might have been a run-up the day before, we're not sure about that, but they closed the Martin plant. My mother and my older brother were present at the first flight. My dad had just turned 29 years old. When the bomber was well into production, my dad did get another job at Martin. He moved over to do a couple of heavy bombers no one's ever heard of, the B-33 and the B-35. But before that failed, he was promoted again, chief of new design, and he worked on some later models of the B-26, planning for an E and an F model, and at least 5 military aircraft and 5 commercial planes that were bought by airlines. Throughout World War II, he served as a technical consultant to all of the services and the Royal Air Force, and he served as a combat observer with the Navy and the Army Air Corps. In 1945, he was promoted to Director of Commercial Sales and served in that capacity for 3 years. Although he left the Martin Company in 1948, he never forgot his roots in the aviation industry, and the development of the B-26 Marauder was always the crowning achievement of his career. He had the ability to create any kind of company to accomplish and make any kind of product. He was extraordinarily intelligent, and as long as he was working hard to achieve some kind of a success, he was very happy. In the next 28, he created many business opportunities based on his creative research and development. I'll give you a few examples. He developed an infrared reflective protective coating for roofs, and from that he created a company called the International Chemical Corporation. He designed and improved food processing equipment. He helped foreign companies set up manufacturing plants. He developed colored synthetic paving materials, helped develop silencers during the Vietnam War for the M14, M16, and the 7.62 GE minigun. In 1964, he formed a Magruder Paving and Engineering Company and served as president general manager. By this time, he had 3 boys, Marshall, Bob, and Doug, and all were in military service in Vietnam in different units. While we were off at war, Dad became the local South Florida expert on the Southeast Asia region. He took to the talk shows in his own one-man campaign. His favorite was a weekly call-in show he helped organize in Miami with a panel of ex-military officers. The host was Alan Courtney, but sometimes he did his thing with a local upstart named Larry King, now of CNN fame. Dad believed that it was not good enough to sit on your hands and sing about patriotism, that you had to be active in the support of your country. Y'all are looking bad again. I'm going to deviate again. I heard that comment When I'd come home from Vietnam, he took me to a luncheon at the Kiwanis Club. And the Kiwanians had just finished doing the Pledge of Allegiance, Star Spangled Banner, singing God Bless America, Lord's Prayer, and anything else you can think of. And then they sat down to listen to my dad, and he started out with that comment: "It's not good enough to sit on your hands and sing about patriotism." And he blasted them. You get out of your heinies and get out in the streets and take them back. He was really relatively involved in against the anti-war movement in this country. Needless to say, we had a tragedy in the family. A couple of months later, my younger brother Doug was killed at Dak To with the 173rd Airborne. This had a relatively severe impact on the family, and it still does. It drives me in a lot of things I do today. It made it real easy for me to devote a lot of time to building a book for you. Call him wish I'll put clothes on. B-26 Memorials Guide. Little group I'm with of Marauder men in Washington area has put together something for you. We're going to offer it to you tomorrow. I'm going to offer the first one to Trevor Allen.
Thank you very much indeed.
For his thanks and everything he does for this society. My dad sold his business and went to Vietnam. Spent more time in Vietnam than his sons all did cumulatively. Worked for a company called Pacific Architect and Engineering, using some of his executive engineering skills. In January 1982, Peyton Magruder died from heart failure at the age of 70. I can attest that nothing he ever accomplished had more meaning than the development of the B-26 and the safety record that you achieved with the B-26 units during World War II. On behalf of my father, I'd like to thank and salute the Glenn L. Martin workers, retirees that are here today, and all of their compatriots in other industry that produced this magnificent plane, the B-26, Martin Marauder. And on behalf of my family, I'd like to thank you all for including us today. Appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Well, Glenn Martin started production, and as they continued, they grappled with the problems of this revolutionary aeroplane. Well, Alan Spreen was a Martin inspector, and he's going to tell you something of that production.
They never built a prototype of a B-26. They started right from scratch. Peyton Magruder, who's apparently a whiz of an engineer, designed this thing on paper, and it was a beautiful thing, like a torpedo, as everyone knows. And I was on the first line where the jigs and fixtures put up, where the first one came through. No prototype. They were made, these jigs, which are precision drilled, the wings, and then we drilled all the holes in them. They picked up on a conveyor, put them in a final assembly jig, which really was just a wooden cradle. You sat it in, then you put the nose section up, and you prayed that the bolts would all fit. And mostly they always did. If they didn't, you had to ream them, put a larger bolt in, make a note in an Army book that this didn't fit completely right. And you did the same with the tail, and then you put the wings on. Of course, the wings were very precision fit. They had big aluminum extrusions along the contour of the wing, which bolted onto the section on the midsection of the airplane. And they were all torqued up and all. Then the gear was installed, and then it was set down on this gear, taken out of the wooden cradle, rolled along the floor to the front, and then engines were installed on this shell of an airplane. Engines, propellers, turrets, the glass nose, and the cockpit. I think we got up to, as I recall, almost one every 2 days, but it was stepped. And then he moved the first one out the door, closed the doors, moved the next one up. Everything would be shuffled. Everybody stopped working and moved the next one. They ran them out in the ramp, and of course that took a period of well over a year and get them on a flight line. And then the first ones were flown. And we lined the runway to watch it go. A whole bunch of us from the shop down. 2 people went, were Ken Evil and I think there was a flight engineer with test equipment on the first one now, come to think of it.
Mr. Evil come out and asked me how the airplane was. I said, it's about as good as I can make it. So he says, okay. He says, you think we can fly it tomorrow morning? I said, it's up to you. So he says, you put 2 parachutes in the tail end of the airplane. If Peyton Magruder comes around and wants to know what we're going to do today. Tell them we're just going to make a few taxi runs and that's all. So sure enough, Peyton Magruder come around. He wanted to know what the program was for the day. I was just going to make a couple of taxi runs and that's all for the day. You're not going to fly? No, we're not going to fly today. So he left, and Ken Evil come out, and he says, "We ready to go?" I said, "Yep, all ready." So we both got in the airplane and started up, and taxied out to the runway. Got to the end of the runway. We stood there and had me get the parachutes up. So I got the two parachutes up front. And Ken Evil turned to me and says, "Now, Al, if you want to back out," he says, "I'll never hold it against you." I said, "No, I wouldn't back out now. If I knew the thing wouldn't fly, I wouldn't back out." So with that, why, we fastened our seat belts. And there's a large Colesman airspeed indicator mounted on the instrument panel. Ken says, "You watch the airspeed indicator and let me know at what speed we break ground." So we started down the runway towards the plant, and by the time we hit about 120, I closed my eyes. And about that time, he pulled it off and climbed to, I guess we were about 10,000 feet. He leveled off and turned the wheel and stick back and forth, and he says, "It's mushy." So he says, "How about taking a walk back through the tail and see what you can see?" So I looked out the side waist gunner's windows and called him up front. "The flaps are still down." He says, "Well, the handle's up." "Well, you got about half flap." So he says, "Okay, come on up front." I'll come back up front. He says, "You think you can hold this thing straight and steady for a while till I take a look?" I said, "Yeah, I can hang on to it." So I flew the airplane while he went back and took a look at the flap situation. And he come back up front. He says, "Well, what goes up has got to come down, so let's find out what speed we're going to have to land it at." So we made a couple of stalls clean, a couple dirty, and determined that we'd have to land somewhere around 130 or 140. That was quite exciting. When we touched down, Ken made a kind of a tail wheel landing, and when that nose started to go over, I thought we were going to do a somersault. Anyway, we beefed up the flap rods, made about 4 flights after that till we finally got the flaps to where they would go up and stay up. And we turned the airplane over to the flight test section at Fenimore, and Bill Street was the flight test engineer. And the first flight they made, they had a hydraulic line break at one of the engine pumps, and they had to make emergency landing at Bowling Field. They called the plant. I jumped in my car and hightailed it for Bowling Field. Got down there and took a piece of cowling off and saw what had happened. I figured, oh heck, in 30 minutes I'll have this airplane out of here. Well, as it turned out, we got the line and got a bunch of hydraulic fluid, replaced the line and filled the system with hydraulic fluid, and lo and behold, nothing would work. All the hydraulic valves were shattered because of air. Piece by piece, I rebuilt the hydraulic system. Stayed at Bowling Field for a whole week, getting the airplane ready to fly. Finally got it out of there and got it back to the plant. And of course, that tickled me, because at the wages I was getting then, 32.5 cents an hour, this was all double time that I spent with the airplane. So, and the pay came just before Christmas, which was really welcome.
It was decided that the first B-26s would go to the 22nd Bomb Group at Langley.
In February of 1941, I was selected along with Art Snell, a first lieutenant reserve, to go to Baltimore to the Martin plant for 2 weeks, education on the B-26. I couldn't have been happier. I'd been flying B-17s, B-18s, PT-17s, and all kind of stuff like that at Langley Field, and now we were going for a brand new bomber. So Art and I went up there, and what a pleasant time that was. We're staying at the hotel, visiting the plant every day. And then on February, let me further note now, on February the 25th, 1941, I got my first ride in the B-26 for 45 minutes as co-pilot. And on March the 27th, 1941, I was co-pilot with pilot Snell from Baltimore to Langley Field, 45 minutes. My total time now in the B-26 was 1 hour and 30 minutes. On April the 1st, I got 35 minutes pilot time, and on April the 1st, I got 35 minutes co-pilot time. And then on the second day of April, I took the third airplane out of the plant and went to Langley Field with it. And on the 18th of April, I flew it again for 1 hour and 15 minutes. I now have a big total of about 2 hours and 50 minutes in the airplane.
And the 22nd Bomb Group began learning about this new bird. Walter Meyersberger, an aeronautical engineer and an original pilot in the 22nd Bomb Group, was deeply involved in this.
The 22nd Bomb Group was assigned the Accelerated Service Test Program. The task was to identify defects, obtain performance data, and to qualify pilots. Starting in March 41 at Patterson Field, there are 3 test periods, each interrupted by grounding orders to correct safety of flight items. Perhaps the first was to increase the caster angle of the nose wheel and to strengthen it. That the strut is the nose wheel strut. The engine impeller had to be vented to prevent surging at altitude. A fix was required to prevent part of the carburetor heat assembly from falling into the impeller, which had caused the first engine failure and indirectly the first belly landing. At high speed, there was aileron overbalance, which could cause flutter and wing failure. Unknown to the 22nd was that during the first factory test flight, their pilot had reported rudder overbalance. Instead of correcting both the aileron and rudder hinges at this time, the factory only reversed the rudder balance tab linkage, a quick fix. Unless the controls were carefully coordinated, the plane would fly in a steady state yaw indefinitely. Only a shove on the opposing rudder would straighten it. The aileron hinge was corrected during the service test interruptions, but the mild rudder lock from the quick fix remained. At Langley, there had been about 5 main landing gear failures, during which the nose gear remained intact. Gradually, it dawned that the squadrons had removed supplies from the rear of the airplane, which the factory had loaded there to make up for the weight of the turret and aft armament, which was as yet unattainable. After delivery, the 22nd Bomb Group had been flying the B-26 beyond design limits, extremely nose heavy. 900 pounds of ballast were added in place of the missing armaments. Other factors had made matters worse. The pilot's manual gave 120 miles per hour as the correct gliding speed. A revision page changed this to 135. A flap stop limited the travel to 30 degrees, which reduced flap drag during landing. The wide 4-bladed propellers power off, and the landing gear doors acted like air brakes. Based on the historic unreliability of engines, the Air Corps had always taught power-off landings. Together, the above factors combined to bleed off the speed so rapidly during the landing flare that the rate of descent had exceeded the design strength of the main landing gear. As the 22nd substituted power-on landings, the gear failures ceased. By late July, most of the defects had been corrected. Performance testing proceeded rapidly. The plane met its design's top speed, but its stalling speed was 10 miles per hour, higher than predicted. It would not hold altitude at such specified power settings. Its range was almost 30% short. Per square foot of wing area, the B-26 carried twice the load of a B-18 and about half again that of a B-17. That summer, flying from dawn to dusk every day, a cautious pilot training program was conducted. Pilots who already qualified on the B-18 were allowed to solo after 10 hours in the B-26. The newest pilots were checked out after 25 hours of co-pilot time. But for both, the co-pilot had to have 10 hours in the airplane. The injury-free record to that date was broken back at Langley Field when a pilot with 2 hours in the B-26 was allowed to solo with a co-pilot with no time in the airplane. It was claimed that the propellers had run away on takeoff, so the pilot had ditched the plane in some woods. No one was killed, but several were severely burned. Runaway props is really a misnomer for engine overspeed. The usual cause was that the pilot forgot to return the propeller control switches back to automatic governing after checking propeller operation before takeoff. That the airplane took off at all is proof that the airplane would fly with the engines overspeeding. It's just a question of how long they would last. It has been claimed that if the plane's batteries were low, the 12-volt electrical system failed to deliver sufficient power to the propellers, allowing the engine to overspeed. The 22nd never found it necessary to install an auxiliary power unit. The later change to 24 volts was Air Force-wide to save copper and weight. In a turn, at long-range cruising speed, at 185 mile an hour indicated, with a 2,400-pound bomb load, the plane's nose tended to rise, indicating instability, although the loading was well within the limits. Despite the flying quality faults that I've mentioned, the designer had achieved an airplane that was fighter-like in its response to controls. Stability is a quality opposing controllability. Like the best fighters, the B-26 was marginally stable, but it was spirally stable, which was a very rare quality. It would hold altitude and heading indefinitely, even if disturbed by gusts. It was these qualities that made the airplane a delight to fly and incomparable as a precision level bomber. The 22nd Service Test Program ended in September when the 13 test airplanes flew to Ellington Field for Louisiana maneuvers. There it flew an exacting schedule before being returned to Langley Field in October. On December 8th, the group was transferred to Muroc Dry Lake for anti-submarine patrol, and en route, the group suffered its first fatal crash of undetermined origin. During December, it suffered 2 more fatal crashes that were weather-related. During January 42, the planes were flown to Sacramento Air Depot for shipment overseas to an undisclosed destination. Because of the 22nd's experienced line crews and the cautious pilot training program at Patterson Field, the operational service of the B-26 got off to a flying start April 5th from Australia.
Well, Britain and its Commonwealth had been at war since September 1939, but on 7th of December 1941, the United States came into the action.
I had just gotten the headquarters squadron a week before, and in those days, it was old Army, customs. For instance, when I got in the 2nd bomb group, each of the new lieutenants that was in that group, there were about 6 of us, called on the commander, who was Major George, later Lieutenant General George, called on the commander in tuxedo with our wives, with our cards stuffed up our sleeves so we could drop them in the basket. Never sat down one time during the 15 minutes we were there and walked out the door. So I got my squadron I'm going to have a party for them. So we invited all of them to come over. And they're all dressed up, too. And they come over. We heard about the war by a neighbor coming to the back door and say, "Did you hear on the radio that Pearl Harbor was bombed?" I said, "No, I didn't, but I know what's going to happen now." In fact, I told my wife I'm going to pay off the government now for training me to fly an airplane. And as they came, I left right then, down to the hangar, which was about 4 blocks away. And as the couples came to the door, Lucy said to the guy, "Boy, the war started, down to the hangar, and ladies, come on in." And I didn't see her again till 2:30 that morning. And then I was gone, lock, stock, and barrel.
Every airplane that we could possibly get in the air on December the 8th left for the West Coast from Langley.
The 22nd flew sub-patrol on the West Coast, then dismantled its planes, and they were shipped to Hawaii, where they were reassembled, and then they went on to Australia. In Australia, the 22nd Bomb Group was based at Townsville, but to fly a mission, it had first to fly to 7 Mile Airfield at Port Smoresby in New Guinea, there to refuel, and then fly the mission. And they flew their first mission on April the 5th, 1942. And Chris Kilgus was on that mission.
We had just arrived in Australia a couple of days before. We flew on up to Townsville, and they put two 1,000-pound I put two 1,000-pound bombs on my airplane, our airplane. And that afternoon, they came around and said, "Take your two 1,000-pound bombs out and put these 24 100-pound bombs on." So I said, "Okay." My crew chief, Sergeant Beaucamp, had gone to chow at lunch, and on his return, I had already taken the nose fuse and the tail fuses out, and when I could see, I was standing up in the bomb bay, and I could see his shoes when they come underneath there, and so I released one of those 1,000-pound bombs. And Beaucamp to this day hadn't forgiven me, but he was moving fast, but he wasn't going anyplace. So never again, he said, let that happen, and I never did let that happen again when he was around. It was decided when they put the 100-pound bombs on that we were to have a definite part in the raid the next day. We flew on to, from Townsville to Port Moresby in New Guinea. It's a 3-hour flight over water all the way. And we got to Port Moresby, and they had 2 runways, one called 7 Mile and one called 3 Mile. The 3 Mile was a fighter strip, the 7 Mile was for B-17s, B-26s, whatever they had was at the 7 Mile field. The B-26 always took off downhill. The runway ran up and down. We took off downhill regardless of the wind. It didn't make any difference. We had 3,000 feet of mesh runway, and then the overrun we had was just nothing but dirt and gravel. So you see, we had to have the difference of the elevation to get up to speed. When we arrived at Port Moresby, there was nothing. It was jungle and lots of mosquitoes, millions of mosquitoes. Of course, we had flown 3 hours from Townsville up there to get ready for the mission, and no gas trucks came out. Natives come rolling out 55-gallon drums of gasoline, so then we had to crank it into the airplane for refueling. And incidentally, we always used a chamois to put over the gas tank to keep the water and condensation out of it, because you didn't want to be out 2 hours over the water and go, you know, and you're looking around, what's going on? But it did help. That chamois always stayed in our airplanes. We were brief, well, let me carry on a little bit. At Port Moresby, there was no tents, no billeting, no food, no nothing, except these B-26s that had flown up there. And we ended up having to sleep on the wing of the airplane that night, because the higher off the ground you were, the less mosquitoes there were. And that was a help. Then we found out there was an aluminum shack up at the end of the runway, another 500 yards or so, called Sloppy Joe's. And we had hardtack crackers, orange marmalade, baked bean sandwiches, and coffee. and a little bit of water that wasn't too tasty. Needless to say, that night was very hectic. Then the next morning, sun came up. We were briefed for about 10 minutes on the fact that we had a picture showing us the runways at Lacanau Aerodrome, and this was at Rabaul. That was where our mission was going, Rabaul, New Britain. And the guy says, I can't tell you what the weather's gonna be because you all flew through it hedge-hopping islands from Hawaii, and you know from 15 minutes now what's gonna be 30 minutes, you had no idea. So we went down, and there was no control tower. All there was just this 7-mile strip downhill. And at a scheduled time, we went out. Now they tried, and this was proven later, we took off around 9 o'clock all the time when we bombed Rabaul. We'd get up to Rabaul at noon, 3-hour flight up there, make our mission, do the bombing, turn around and come back, 6-hour mission. In the meantime, the Japanese were bombing Port Moresby and the 7-mile runway. The engineers, the engineering battalion that they had there of some natives, some Afro-Americans, whatever, but they all had pitching shovels and carrying on, filling up bomb craters, and they did a good job. Needless to say, we didn't break any landing gears or nose wheels when we came back, but it was because of them. The mission took off. We had 9 airplanes. 2 of us, my crew, which was flown, our pilot was Second Lieutenant Richard Walker Robinson, better known in later days as Robbie, who was the leader of the Red Raiders of the 22nd Bomb Group. And we had a wingman and his crew, and his name was Second Lieutenant Tad Ford. And both of us had 100-pound bombs on. We were to bomb the runways. The other airplanes had 500-pound and 1,000-pound bombs on, 2 1,000 or 4 500s, and then we had a bomb bay tank in the left side of the front bomb bay. In my plane, with the bomb bay tank in the left side, we had 1,200-pound bombs on the right side, and we used the rear bomb bay in the original B-26, and we had 12 100-pound bombs in the rear bomb bay. We take off. After takeoff, you have to go over the Owen Stanley mountain range. So you fly over the jungle for 30 or 40 minutes and go up through a pass instead of having to go over the mountain range, Owen Stanley. We went through this pass. As soon as we got through the pass, we went back down on the water, and Gazmata was over on our left as we were flying toward Rabaul. And there was a Japanese air base there, and we didn't want to get picked up by radar or whatever. And so we got back right down on the water, 100 feet or so, and flew on to Rabaul. Now, at our briefing, which was very brief, I was told that there was a volcano that was semi-active, and we would see smoke from that, and that would be our signal that we were getting close to Rabaul. Otherwise, just dead reckoning navigation. So, and over water, you don't do too much dead reckoning navigation. However, we got to Rabaul up close enough to where we started seeing the volcano smoke. And as we got a little bit closer in, we saw a huge ship. It was my first time. I was an enlisted bombardier, incidentally. PFC, 20 years old, on his first bombing mission. Didn't know what in the hell was going on, but I was excited. Now, let me explain Rabaul to you. Rabaul is a horseshoe-shaped harbor. And if this is the horseshoe, out here is the volcano outside of the harbor. And so when we got up close enough to see the harbor, here sat an aircraft carrier tied up to the docks. And I called the pilot and Lieutenant Robinson, I said, let's deviate here and go over there and let me drop a couple of these bombs on that aircraft carrier. No, he wouldn't do it. regardless of, there wasn't much argument. You know, he said, no, our mission is to bomb the runways so that the other planes can bomb the ships in the harbor. Okay, so here we go. By that time, we saw, instead of being a troop ship, which I thought it was at first, it turned out to be this aircraft carrier. So, and going on then towards the volcano, we started climbing, got up in the smoke of the volcano, and then we could see Lakanai Aerodrome, which was over on the outside of the horseshoe. So we opened the bomb bay doors, put into a dive, clocked about 375 or whatever the airspeed was, and we let down. And we went down to 300 feet at 375, and we dropped 24 100-pound bombs. The accompanying ship in the number 2 position also had 24 100-pound bombs that they dropped. We destroyed some airplanes on the field. We kept the Zeros from coming up bothering the other planes. As we turned off of the airfields and made a turn to the right to get back down on the water, we flew over a building, and I saw these 2 red cross panels laid out on top of the building. So naturally, I just said, well, that's a hospital. Well, but then by the time a couple of seconds went by, we were flying over it, and I could see the machine gun emplacements on the roof of this building. And my co-pilot back there chomping and raising hell, get him, get him, get him. Well, I couldn't get him because zip, we were gone. So I remembered that. And in the course of flying and dropping the bombs, our accompanying plane, Lieutenant Ford's plane, got shot up quite a bit. And as we turned and came off and came back out onto the water and started to climb back up a little bit, he had lost an engine because of an oil leak, and of course it was overheating. He was still running it. The 3-hour flight back to get back to New Guinea, we tried to stay behind him by climbing and then diving down and picking him back up again so we could stay behind him and drop our life raft and stuff. We figured that they were going to have to go down in the water. Fortunately, they didn't have to, but eventually we lost them. Got into some thunder squalls and showers that you have no idea down there in the South Pacific of the terrific weather that they put up with. But anyway, we got separated, and so we decided then the best thing we could do, no communication. Now, you didn't use the radio silent. So we decided then to head on our course on back to Port Moresby. Fortunately for Lieutenant Ford and their crew, they did fly a single engine for quite a while and let the engine cool down, restarted it, climbed back up to some altitude, shut it off, and they made it back and crash landed as soon as they got back to the coast of New Guinea, and eventually got back to the squadron about, 60 days later. Here we are trying to get back, and we know that we're gonna have to come back up on the Owen Stanley mountain range, come through that pass, and then get back down and get to Port Moresby. Gentlemen, ladies, kids, if there are any here, when you get on that red light, it gets ticklish. And another thing that bothered us, we had a Bombay tank. As soon as we started flying, after 30 minutes of flying, we started transferring fuel. And by the time we'd flown an hour and a half, we had transferred the fuel out of that Bombay tank into our wing tank, so we knew that we had to empty the Bombay tank, and all the gas we had was up there where we could get it into the engines. Consequently, this made us fly over the target with an empty Bombay tank. Now, if you can picture us seeing Japanese Zeros shooting at us with tracer bullets, with the fumes in that Bombay tank, it was another thought to you. You wondered what in the hell was going on, and consequently, several of the boys dropped their Bombay tanks, and the next day an order came out that there was a fine, I believe it was a $1,000 fine, but it was huge at that time for whatever it was. If you dropped your Bombay tank, the pilot got fined because we had none to replace it. We had nothing to replace anything with down there. That's why we quit using the B-26s. So we completed our mission. We got back to Marsby. We got out. We kissed the ground. I'm telling you, it was something else. The thing that I remember most about the mission, I just heard in TV here a few months ago, what we couldn't do to Rabaul, that volcano did by nature. It destroyed the city of Rabaul and the harbor. It erupted violently. Now, for you all that don't know, a mission, the ladies in here, I know the gentlemen all have had the missions and everything, but when you go on that first mission, you do nothing right. Everything, you never know. We had no experience. Some of y'all were trained by myself and others like me that had come back from the Pacific, and we tried to train you all what to expect. But I went on this mission with GI shoes on, unlaced. They weren't tied up. The first experience I got was when I fired the machine gun, and those hot cartridges, I had a 30 caliber in the nose in those days, and those 30 caliber cartridges flying down on the inside of my GI shoes stopped that. And there's missions that I could go on and talk to you about and everything, but of the 9 airplanes that took off, only 7 returned, unfortunately.
Well, meanwhile, trouble was brewing up in the Aleutians at the North Pacific. And the man who knows about what was going on in the Pacific is John Clough, and he's going to tell you all about that.
2 squadrons of B-26s, the 73rd and 77, served in Alaska and participated in the Aleutian campaign during 1942. Most historians have ignored their contributions. As will be covered later, the 77 Bomber Squadron deployed on short notice to Alaska in January 1942 as part of a buildup of forces following Pearl Harbor. Shortly afterwards, the 73rd Bomber Squadron exchanged its B-18s for B-26s. Interestingly, the Marauders were from the first 200 produced by Martin and bore no model number. New and untested, they were ill-suited for the harsh Alaskan conditions. They were operationally deployed for the first time in the theater to counter the Japanese base attack against the Navy base at Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands. Supremely overconfident after a stunning series of victories, the Japanese launched their Midway Aleutian operations to expand their empire further eastward. They planned to establish a new defensive line that ran from the western Aleutians through Midway to New Guinea. The plan, completed before the Diddler raid, also called for a diversionary carrier raid against Dutch Harbor. Forewarned by intelligence, the 11th Air Force deployed its forces to advanced bases at Cold Bay on the Alaska Peninsula, east of Dutch Harbor, and Umnak to the west. 12 B-26s were sent to Cold Bay and 6 to Umnak, along with the heavy bombers and fighters. The Japanese struck Dutch Harbor as planned on the morning of 2 June. After inflicting minimal damage, the carrier task force withdrew to support a planned landing on Adak in the Central Aleutians. However, the weather turned bad and the operation was canceled. The task force turned and struck Dutch Harbor again on the afternoon of 4 June. A PBY crew located the carriers, and the 11th Air Force launched a series of bomber attacks. Captain Owen Meal led the B-26s from Umnak, but failed to find the Japanese. Colonel William O. Erickson, overall air commander of the bomber force, led another attack consisting of 5 torpedo-equipped B-26s from Cold Bay. The B-26s became separated in a fog, and Colonel Erickson ordered the pilots to land at Umnak. Captains George Thornburgh and Henry Taylor, either not hearing the orders or ignoring them, continued on. Shortly afterward, they spotted the Japanese in the swirling mist. The Navy had done the best to train the B-26's crews on torpedo attacks, a procedure that required the bombers to make long, steady, low-level approaches to their targets. Captain Taylor and his crew went in first. After 3 unsuccessful runs with his navigator wounded and his bomber badly riddled with gunfire from ships encircling Zeros, Taylor turned back. Captain Thornborough, after making several unsuccessful runs, decided to deliver his torpedo like a bomb. Diving to spin the impeller of the torpedo required a number of revolutions to arm it. Thornborough dropped it on the carrier Rougeau. The carrier deck pitched down in a swell and the torpedo flashed over and hit the water with it exploding. Frustrated, Captain Thornborough returned to Cold Bay, briefed the location of the Japanese, rearmed the 500-pound armor-piercing bombs, and headed out again as a sealing lord at Cold Bay. Later that night, radio operators at Cold Bay heard him report that he was at 9,000 feet and attempting a landing in a socked-in base. The body of Thornborough's radio operator was found a month later, still strapped to his seat on a nearby beach. The airfield at Cold Bay was named in honor of Thornborough. O.M. Eales made the last attack of the day. His B-625 pilots found the Japanese and bombed them without inflicting any damage. The Japanese went ahead with their landings on Attu and Kiska, boasting that the diversion of Midway had made possible the great Aleutian victory. It was the only enemy occupation of North American soil during World War II. In order to retake the 2 islands, the Americans and the Canadian allies began an advance down the chain. The uninhabited Adak Island was occupied 30 August. Marauder men began operating out of there shortly afterwards. Flying missions against Japanese installations on Kiska and Japanese shipping in the area. First blood was drawn on 16 October when Captain Richard Salter led a deck-level attack against the 2 Japanese destroyers, sinking 1. On 27 November, 4 B-26s led by Captain John Pletcher sank a Japanese transport headed for Kiska. Despite the successes, the days of the Marauders and the Aleutians were numbered. It did not stand up well against the primitive conditions, and its relative short range hampered operations over vast distances of that theater of operation. By the end of 1943, the B-26 had been withdrawn from operation in favor of the longer range, easy to operate B-25. Richard Salter referred to the B-26 as a good aircraft in a wrong theater of operation. The only B-26 unit left in theater with 15 tow target was continuing to fly the Marauder. Like Midway, the B-26's contributions to the Aleutian campaign have been ignored by most historians.
Well, meanwhile, some of the 22nd Bomb Group's planes were still being reassembled at Hickam in Hawaii. And Jim Collins had just arrived there with a flight of 4 69th Bomb Squadron B-26s. At the direction of the Navy, 4 of these Marauders were rigged with Navy torpedoes and had flown to Midway at the end of May.
But anyway, eventually, June the 4th came, and a Jeep came up and handed me the message that they had sighted the Japs at 315 degrees and about 180 miles, and to take off and attack.
And they gave us the heading and distance, and away we went, not knowing if it was a merchant ship, as an aircraft carrier, or what it was. And we had no more than cleared the island, and you could look up and see the Japanese Zeros and dive bombers in waves coming in to hit the little island of Midway.
It was a misty, foggy day with a lot of clouds up about 2,000 feet.
But we went on out and were down low, 50, 100 feet off the water, and suddenly popped over the horizon was a whole flock of Japanese ships. And they were everywhere. The first ones we encountered were destroyers, way out in front of the main battle fleet.
But we hit a carrier right head on.
And our gunners were keep them busy, firing as we approached and as we left. But then the Zeros picked us up. And that's where the problems came in.
Just off to our right of the carrier, there were 6 Zeros, wing to wing. So we had to turn left to keep from hitting the Zeros head on. So we turned left down the line of ships to get enough room to turn back and make 180 and come back on our carrier, which worked out very good. The only problem was that somehow or another the fighters must have caught up with Mays and Watson in our formation, because they weren't flying a tight formation, and Murray and I were up forward, and we weren't bothered as much with the fighters as the other 2 planes were. So I never knew whether the fighters shot the other 2 down or whether anti-aircraft from the ship shot them down.
And in order to approach our target, which was the carrier Akagi, at a 45-degree angle from the bow, we had to cross this great expanse of water where every ship fired their anti-aircraft guns. And that was a bad one because the big guns were shooting into the water, causing water spouts that we had to duck. And the Navy had instructed us that we had to drop at 150 miles an hour at 150 feet. Well, the airplane didn't fly 150 miles an hour. That was almost stall speed. So we were somewhat higher than that when we crossed this barrage area. And the Zeros, you've got to give them credit for right with us. They went through that barrage area just the same as we did, and they were shooting us all the way through.
But anyway, we turned the fish loose, and I didn't want to go back to Midway down the same line of fire that the Japs were returning from. So instead of turning right to go back, I turned to the left and went north and then west to circle the fleet, and I was going to go south back to Midway and miss all of the Japanese fighters.
And immediately thereafter, we were jumped by the Japanese Zero planes, and they were plentiful, and they were very brave when they had you outnumbered.
Then I pulled up in the clouds, and I thought the battle was over, when all of a sudden a whole bunch of 20 millimeter came by right underneath my feet. A plane had slipped up on us and shot from low left, low right, and the waist gunner got him, but in the meantime he shot out our hydraulic system.
We evaded, went into the clouds, the pilot did, and one of our evade some of the action. At another time, they were coming right at us, and our pilot went into an immediate dive. In fact, I wasn't even strapped in the seat, and I hit the ceiling, or the top of the plane. But we evaded them and finally got away from them. And then after all of that, then we didn't know where we were.
So we continued straight south, still out of the line of return Zeros, until we came to a little sand key down there that our navigator recognized, and then we turned east and hit Midway right on the nose.
And we landed at Midway and had to crash land. And it's a very good crash landing type. All he did was our pilot college had all to get in the rear of the plane.
I dropped the gear, but then the nose didn't come down because we didn't have any hydraulics at all. And the tower told me to ditch, but I had learned from the 22nd Bomb Group, you don't ditch. So I came in and landed, and the nose dropped down and the plane was going straight. So I crawled up on top and sat up on top of the canopy and held on to the radio mast so I'd be ready to swim when we went off the end of the runway. But we stopped right on the very, very end of the runway.
After our launch, the Akago was turning toward us, and we had been coming in from 45 off the bow, so it was almost a straight shot down the flight deck, which was fortunate simply because every gun on the carrier was firing out and up, but nobody had prepared for some airplane flying the full length of their deck. And that's where we went, down the deck, and in fact low enough that I think we could have touched the deck with our wheels if we had put them down. But we had been shot up so bad that the airplane was flying a bit hazardously. You'd try to make a turn and it'd want to fall off on us. The rudder was shaking and banging, and the engines were pounding pretty badly, which we didn't know was all the blades of the propellers were perforated. Some were hit with pretty big rounds because great gaping chunks of steel were torn out of those props, and just small slivers were left holding them on. Well, by that time, all the cushions in the back of the airplane were on fire, the gunners were shot up, and we had no defense except speed. And we got on the water, the co-pilot went back, and
I didn't have anything else to do at the time. At my plane, I was concerned. Naturally, I got up and went back and tried to do something about it. Then when I found out what a slipstream is all about, I tried to throw those cushions out the side window. It wouldn't go. 200 miles or better of wind going by there, just threw it right back in. All it was firing those cushions. I finally took them and threw them out through the tail gunner position and pulled Private Ashley back from that position. And with his advice and guidance and what I already knew, I'd been told how to do this, got the guns cleared, and started a running battle with the fighters. Of course, the minute that Jim had gone to the point where he was over the Akagi, he pushed the throttles absolutely wide open. The fighters were still firing at us, but once they got the guns going and could fire back, found out that our .50 calibers had considerably more range than whatever caliber they were firing.
And if somebody would ask us what we did out at Midway, we'd say we dropped a torpedo. And honestly, that's all we could say.
Well, I think that most historians have come to realize that what the Marauders did at Midway was to get the Zeros down from altitude so that when the Navy dive bombers came, they encountered no air opposition and were able to deliver a fatal blow to the Japanese task force. Well, back in Hawaii and back in the USA, the 69th and 70th Bomb Squadrons had departed the US, and there were still a few B-26 crews left. And the British, well, they were anxious to use the B-26, and Ken Wellborn obliged.
Flint Garrison, who was a lieutenant colonel, and myself were dispatched to Egypt to convert a RAF Blenheim Squadron to B-26s. We took off from West Palm Beach about the 8th of July, 1941. The first month or so of operations with the RAF squadron was conducted at a landing ground 442, which was about halfway between Alexandria and Cairo. It was a bare landing ground with no buildings whatever on it. It just had a runway and was out in the middle of the desert. Flint and I were billeted at the Mena House Hotel, which was adjacent to the pyramids. This training went on for through the month of July, August, and September, and in the 1st of September we moved from LG 442 back to a depot base which was down on the Red Sea, and the rest of our training took place at that time. Flint Garrison was doing most of the tactical indoctrination with the Western Desert Air Force in Cairo, while I was doing the engineering work and the transition of pilots. And Flint, however, gave some transition to some of the high-ranking officers in the RAF, and he had a rather traumatic experience one day. He was coming in to land at this strip, and a RAF corporal had a truck. The RAF, of course, referred to him as a lorry, and he decided the last minute he could make it across the runway before the airplane landed. And he got in the middle of the runway, and the aircraft hit him with the undercarriage and killed both men, and of course wiped out the landing gear. Flint, who was flying, felt the jar, but he didn't know what had happened until he started skidding along on his belly.
In late August, and they were the B-26As, the ones with short wings that didn't fly. But we made them fly, and we had two excellent instructors from the United States Air Force, Colonel Garrison and Major Weldon. And we found that in taxiing the aircraft, we had good visibility and good brakes, and on takeoff, there was plenty of power, and the aircraft did not swing. And the landing, although fast, was as straight as a dart, also without any swing.
They were charged with keeping our side informed of the goings and comings of shipping in the Mediterranean. This involved 3 a day, single ship flights of 7 or 8 hours, but they were also given bombing and torpedo missions, and on one occasion carried ordnance that no other Marauder unit delivered.
Our squadron was allotted a very important task to mine a certain channel between the island of Euboea and Greece. We carried two 1,200-pound mines, and we were a formation of 3 aircraft that took off from Shalufa. The trip lasted 8.5 hours and was a round trip of 1,650 miles. All of it was flown at 50 feet, and we struck the target at midday, knowing that the Italians were probably on guard and might be having a siesta. All our mines were dropped absolutely with pinpoint accuracy, and we returned to base safely. A fortnight later, we had to run another trip because no ship was sunk. This time we took off with 2 aircraft with the same load, and we took off from Shalufa and went as far as the Burgi Channel, which is at Kalkis. We also dropped our mines as low and slow as we could with pinpoint accuracy. And the result was that within a week we had sunk 1 ship and damaged another. So the channel was blocked, and therefore the oil that was coming from Romania to Greece was cut off, and the ships that had to go out into the Aegean Sea, where it was much easier for our submarine to destroy them.
The 69th and 70th Squadrons did not find themselves in a very reassuring situation.
We went overseas with 13 airplanes. We never got any replacements. We never were expanded into a group or anything like that. And we went over completely untrained. None of us had ever flown over water before. Our navigators were just fresh out of navigation school and had never done anything like that. Our bombardiers had never dropped a bomb, and our gunners had never fired a shot out of an airplane. And I guess someone has to be the first, and there isn't anyone to train the first. And so we went to combat in that shape. And things were going very badly in the Pacific, as you remember, the Philippines and the Japanese going on and so forth. I think it would be a fair statement to say that the majority of us, I think, felt that, well, we were going over there, but I don't think we expected to get back.
The Marines landed at Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands in either late August or early September.
American forces, mostly Marines, made an invasion of Guadalcanal and retook the airport, Henderson Field. But then what we had was the airport while the Japanese had the island. We were told then to take our torpedoes, fly to Espiritu Santo, report to the Navy for employment. We got there about 10 o'clock in the morning. We sat around for a couple hours, during which time we observed a B-17 with its elevator shot off. He'd been up in the Guadalcanal and the Solomons fighting and got his elevator shot off. He returned to Espiritu Santo to land. And of course, with not any elevators there, only trim tabs, had a pretty bouncy landing, but made it successfully. Then about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Navy said, there's a naval battle taking place off the shores of Guadalcanal. Take your torpedoes, fly up there, attack the Japanese fleet, and go in and land at Henderson Field. And I said, do they know we're coming? He said, no, we have no communication with them. I said, well, might they not be up there to shoot us down? He said, well, we hope not, but get going. So we took off then, and we got there just about dusk, just about the time it was dark. Luckily, the Navy battle had ended. The Japanese fleet had gone north to Bougainville, and the Marines were up to shoot us down. They pulled off at just the last second, and I talked to the squadron commander of this Marine fighter squadron some days later. He said, I can't imagine anybody being dumb enough to attack an airfield with torpedoes. I was either looking at some real dumb Japanese to attack an airfield with torpedoes or some Americans. I decided that they were Americans, so I pulled off and didn't shoot. Then we landed at Henderson Field that night. No dinner, no bed. Japanese were at the edge of the field shooting at us with cannons and little light of fire. As I said before, we had the field and they had the island.
During this period, when US forces only held the field, the Japanese the rest, the 69th and the 70th took turns at Guadalcanal, where the living conditions were less than ideal.
There was a washing machine Charlie, they called him, that would come over about every night and just harassing. And you'd have to get out of the sack.
The minute the bombs start to fall, you forget about mosquitoes. You jump out of the bed and into a foxhole, and there you are stark naked, while the mosquitoes chew on you and give you malaria. Well, I'm one of those who got malaria. So then, because of that, in our case, we put a foxhole in the middle of our tent. I was rooming with John Sharp and Swede Larson. Put a foxhole right in the middle of our tent so we could jump out of the bed into the foxhole.
Dug a slit trench right in the floor of our tent so that we wouldn't have to run so far, and it worked out that we had about a 6-foot-long slit trench, about, maybe 8 feet long and 4 feet deep. We lined it with burlap, and at one end we had lengths of coconut log about 6 feet long that we stretched across so we had an entranceway so that you could crawl down underneath and get in under these coconut logs. It saved us a few steps, and we got into a foxhole quicker if you had it right in our tent.
and then the Japanese were sitting over there with explosive shells lobbing them out of the field. That's pretty scary business. And then a rather amusing incident happened about 9 o'clock in the morning, because somebody walked out in the middle of our dispersal area where our airplanes were parked with a portable kitchen, a portable oven. They sat it down on the ground, they got a big pitcher of batter, and began cooking pancakes. Well, nobody had had breakfast that morning, so we all got in line with our mess kit to get some pancakes. About the time I worked my way up to the head of the line, the siren blew, air raid coming, so we all dove into a foxhole to protect ourselves. In a very few seconds, as all clear sounded, I jumped out of my foxhole to get back in line, and once more I was back at the back of the line. When I did get up there, I got some raw pancakes. The guy would pour it on, turn it over, and pass it to us. Raw pancakes while you're ducking shells from the Japanese.
Probably the least known of the significant Marauder missions involved only 10 airplanes. By November the 15th, the Japanese had mounted a serious naval threat to Guadalcanal. US forces only held Anderson Field and a small perimeter. The Japanese had beached 4 landing ships less than 5 miles away. But John Sharp was there. Let's hear from him.
The 70th Bomb Squadron with short-wing Marauders was based in Fiji in 1942. In the Solomon Islands, the Marines had just taken Henderson Field at Guadalcanal, codenamed Cactus, and the Japanese were hell-bent on taking it back. In a massive attempt to save face, they had assembled a humongous task force with fresh troops, equipment, and warships. This time, they fully intended to overwhelm any defenses the Americans could muster. On the 13th of November, we were alerted to prepare for torpedo action in the Solomons. We spent the rest of the day uploading torpedoes, and we got the order early the next morning and flew to Espiritu Santo, codenamed Buttons. And we were held there. A giant naval battle was in progress off Guadalcanal, and it's uncertain what the outcome was going to be. Radio communications had been lost, and B-17 reconnaissance painted a dim picture. The American Navy has withdrawn, leaving the Japanese in full control of the sea. The Cactus Air Force was fully involved and was sustaining casualties. Off again in flight order and armed to the teeth, we headed for Cactus. This was when finally the Navy command, in a final desperation, dispatched our Marauders to sink any ship in the water. Now that's a pretty good no-win situation. Off again in flight order and armed to the teeth, we headed for Cactus, hunting for ships, not knowing who held the airfield. Arriving at dusk, we saw no ships, and when we landed, the Navy took our torpedoes and said they would give us bombs to bomb the task force at daylight. The CO and I went to the command post to await instructions. It was a dimly lit tent with everybody speaking in low tones. The invasion was inevitable. About 11 o'clock, all hell broke loose. The sky lit up, the sea lit up, and another major battle was taking place. 2 of our newest battleships had slipped out of hiding and had intercepted the Japanese task force again. The invasion was on, so we went back down to the airplanes to await target assignments. At daylight, somebody in a Jeep came by and said, "A flight changed the bomb load to 20 100-pounders. The troops have landed and we've got to get them." Oh no, I looked at my ship, I said I didn't have enough bomb shackles. So I sent Al, my bombardier, over to a wrecked B-17, told him to bring back all he could. The bombs arrived about the same time and we started loading manually. About halfway through, I got the crew aboard, started engines, and when Al came aboard, I moved out right into a rolling takeoff. We were first off and immediately saw 4 large transports beached what looked to be less than 2 miles away. I climbed to 2,500 feet behind them. There was a lot of activity around these ships, but the bulk of the troops were assembling in the jungle 150 yards in front of the transports. These troops could not be allowed to link up with the main attack force. This was our target. Just behind the transports, I started a diving turn toward the beach. The turret gunner started raking the ships. We could see where the troops were trying to assemble in the jungle, and I turned toward them for a low-level attack. We had no package guns. Al toggled out the bombs, and oops, I was too low. I got a hell of a jolt when our string of bombs hits. Major Stefanowicz followed me. Lieutenant Gressy followed him. We returned to Henderson Field and prepared to rearm. The rest of the squadron was now taking off to bomb the ships with 500 and 1,000-pounders. Any bomb dropped in that quarter-mile square was effective because there was so much activity concentrated there. The ships were clobbered, and the Japanese never got off any of their heavy equipment or heavy weapons off their decks. My airplane had been hit several times with small arms fire and one big hole up through the wing, just missing the gas tank. The situation was touch and go, and we believe we used all of the Navy's bombs at that time. They were short of gas also because they asked if we could make it back to Buttons on the gas we had. Every combat support element had been used and stretched to the limit, but our perimeter held. Henderson Field was in extreme peril on November 15th, and it is most likely that our 10 Marauders were the key element in this victory at Guadalcanal because we were the only heavy strike force available that morning.
The defense of Guadalcanal coincided with the invasion on the other side of the world of Africa. The 319th had arrived there with 12 airplanes.
When we reached Jadida, our proficiency had reached the point where they stood us down for retraining.
When we got our first replacement, we had 6 airplanes left in the whole group. I was seeing an airplane belly in and mechanics taking parts off it before the medics got there.
They pulled us out of combat in February because our losses were so great, and airplanes were depleted, the morale was real low.
And we continued flying up until February, when we were quite low in aircraft, the whole group. They finally decided for us to stop and regroup. So they sent us back.
Both the 17th Bomb Group and the 319th Bomb Group were running short of planes and crews and were stood down from operations. This would have had a far-reaching effect. The 322nd and the 323rd had trained for combat and were on the way to England. The 344th had finished training and was scheduled to follow. Dan Brawner, one of the squadron COs, tells what happened.
We trained and were had our crews ready to go, and they decided to ship us to Lake Charles, Louisiana, to participate in the maneuvers that they were having down there at the time, which was one of the big Louisiana maneuvers, and I'm not sure whether it was the biggest one, but it was one, pardon me, it was one that we had at that time, and it was big enough. Of course, we went through the same thing, bombing at low level, and we were using flour sacks for bombs, so it was a lot of fun to drop bombs in on people and cover them with flour, and I'm sure they didn't like it. In fact, we knew that they did. But that's the way the game was played. While we were at Lake Charles, we were given our ORI, which we passed, and we were ready to go overseas. And suddenly one day an order came into the group taking all of the pilots and crews and their crews and sending them to North Africa as replacements for the B-26 group that were flying out of North Africa. And it was really a blow because we had already been told we were going to Hunter to pick up our airplanes, Hunter being Hunter Air Force Base at Savannah, Georgia. And Dell had been over and looked at them and was real enthused because they were newer models than the ones we were flying. And it was quite a shock to our system.
Well, a decision had been taken to send all the new B-26 groups to England. And 2 squadrons of the 322nd Group had arrived, and...
We'd been training for like 4 or 5 weeks. We were kind of ready to go on a mission.
We were briefed by Colonel Stillman that we were in truth going operational the next morning. We weren't told the target, but the aircraft had been bombed up on that afternoon with us standing by, in effect supervising it, with British armorers loading these 500-pounders aboard, 6 500-pounders to each airplane. But the bombs had 30-minute delay fuses, which was a bit disturbing to all of us. So at 0700 the next morning, we ate a good breakfast and went to a quick briefing and were told the target was at Imoyden, Holland, a power plant which was right close to a German submarine pen on the estuary nearby.
On the way to Hardspan, I said, Scotty, I'll flip a coin with you to see which one of us flies in the pilot seat. He won. He said, I don't know whether by winning I won or not, but anyway, he flew in the pilot seat and I flew co-pilot.
We took off at the scheduled time to the minute, and the other 11 aircraft came right behind us. And we left the British coast at Orfordness. And of course, we ducked right down to 0 altitude with the props practically picking up spray off the water.
As soon as we hit that coast, we started getting fire from all sorts of gun emplacements. Most of it was small fire, looked like about what I call 50 calibers and 20 millimeters. We began to see what we call flak towers that had 20 millimeter guns on them, and they began firing at us.
And we only had to make a turn of, I'd say, 200 yards, and we were exactly on course.
Well, we were keeping our close to the ground. We started running across, I can still remember workers in tulip fields out there, just diving in out of the path of these airplanes coming in, because you can imagine 12 airplanes coming in there at maybe like 30, 40, 50 feet off the ground, all of a sudden jumping over a line of trees there, and here's these people out in the field. Scared me too. They were, we didn't fire at them. Some of the crews did fire at some of these flak towers that were firing at us.
And along at this point, unknown to me then, 2 of the aircraft were hit pretty bad by 20 millimeters, and they each lost an engine. Celio was one of them, and he struck out for the coast single engine and jettisoned his bombs in the North Sea. The other aircraft was flown by Captain Bob Porter of the 452nd, and he likewise struck out for England and jettisoned his bombs in the North Sea also, and they got back to England in good shape. We continued on to the target, and my main concern was keeping that flight exactly on course, and I was relaxed, and Turner was also, and we had one opportunity where a train slid right across our gun sights, but I elected not to fire at it. since my main purpose was to get that flight to the target. All the other aircraft behind me were shooting at it, so I figured there'd be enough damage done anyway. And within 15 seconds of our ETA, the target heaved into view right in front of us. We had to make a turn of maybe 10 degrees. Went over the smokestacks and down to the target, and Turner, of course, dropped the bombs using the torpedo sight, which had been rigged up. But I know we hit the target right on the nose. And at almost the instant that we got to the bottom, to the lowest point on the flight, a 20-millimeter shell came in the cockpit above me and exploded right between Jack Turner and me.
An explosion right over here in relation to me, right over to my left of my head. And I felt I was hit in the chest up here and the legs down here. Scotty, that's when I looked over at Scotty. I just dropped the bomb, looked at Scotty, and he had been hit. This whole side was bloody, and most of the force of this thing hit him. It kind of dazed me when I came out of the daze, which couldn't have been over 2 or 3 seconds. The airplane was in the back because we'd started to get out of there, we'd get down and get on the ground again. Scotty was out of it. I took over. We were pretty close to a crash. And I leveled her off, got a little bit of altitude, maybe up to 50, 75 feet, whatever, and flew out of there.
I knew, as I say, that I was badly hit and bleeding badly, and I knew that Turner was hit. But I called Bill Taylor, who was our radio operator, up, and I said to him over the intercom, please come to the cockpit, I've been hit, and I think I'll need some help. And he came up immediately and put a compress onto my face, and I got the seat back because I didn't think it was wise for me to stay at the controls, that I possibly might pass out. So he pulled me out of the seat, and Turner moved over into the left seat, and Charlie Lane came out of the nose where he had been and finally got into the right seat. And the two of them were able to get the aircraft back to England okay.
We formed up, headed back, and everything went just according to the battle plan. We didn't, no fighters tried to intercept us on the way back or attack us. As soon as we cleared the land, of course, we were out of any anti-aircraft fire, so it was just straight and level ride back till we got back to the field. Then one airplane had received some damage so much that you couldn't land. I landed first because we had Scotty on there who needed attention as fast as we could.
Turner and I were finally hauled out of the aircraft, and I got some plasma immediately and was hauled off to the 5th Evacuation Hospital, which was at Braintree. As usual, something like that happens. It's funny, and the ambulance driver was pretty badly shaken up by seeing all these bloody men, and he got lost on the way to the hospital. But we finally got there. And I well remember lying there on a stretcher on what I could feel was a graveled area, and a bunch of people I could feel gathered around us, and one of the nurses said, thank God we've finally got something besides bicycle accidents to work on. So that's pretty much the story of the first mission from my standpoint.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, up to this point, you've heard about the very few Marauders that were in action and the tough time they had. There was a lot of bravery and a lot of losses. And we're going to call a halt here because 50 years ago, you young men, as you were then, had no trouble with something called a prostate. But I think that I'm not far off the mark when I think that you will probably be wanting to make haste to a little room which we in Britain call a loo now, and you call a John or a WC. And also, I think the tummy would like a little sustenance. They don't serve SOS round here, but I understand, you shouldn't know what that means. I understand that the local Marauder chapter will direct you to the cafeteria and other facilities. Now, it's all important that you don't take too long over your victuals and other things, and I think you should be back here at 1:45. Sorry, whoa, 1:45. 1:45, that's just over 3/4 an hour, about 50 minutes. We're going to have a sharp takeoff. One moment before you go. One moment before you go. We're going to have a sharp takeoff, so be back there then at 1:45. But before you go, show your appreciation to the participants. Okay, thank you. I got lost on one of those cues, as you probably heard.
Didn't show.